As your boots hit the cracked streets leading towards the fabled War 13, you're immediately brought back to a dying world that is anything but welcoming. You start your journey on a crumbling Earth, where you meet the last faction holding the line against the remnants of an apocalyptic invasion that doomed humanity, among which you see many familiar faces that are, surprisingly enough, still alive and kicking, and with lots of stories to share if you're willing to stay a while and maybe listen. From the outset, your interactions with the game's semi-ramshackle hub serve as a grounding point in what lies ahead, offering a small community that is predictably counting on you to be the hero and do the impossible once more. However, despite the introduction sounding like a track down the deja vu lane, you're no longer the destined savior from the first game, but you're still here on a mission to accomplish feats few mortals are capable of, keeping that chosen one trope we all know and love very much alive. After getting your bearings together, you soon step through the first world hopping gateway, where it becomes clear that Earth is the least of your worries this time around, as the root, aka the parasitic cosmic nightmare that's been gnawing on reality since the first game, remains the centerpiece of the universe's problems, even though its hold on Earth has dwindled considerably thanks to our previous contributions. As a sequel that wanted to outgrow its scrappy origins, you can feel the ambition of Remnant 2 leaking like a faulty faucet from no earlier than the very beginning. It steps into the room knowing its predecessor earned cult status, and it obviously intends to build on that legacy with weirder locations, harder enemies, fancier weapons, and a narrative stitched together with the expectation that fan theories and speculations will do the heavy lifting for it to stay afloat. For the players who came in expecting a game that builds upon the foundation it set up years ago but with many more ways to die, the Remnant 2 undoubtedly delivers by staying true to the premise it laid on the table with the announcement trailer. In other words, what it offers is nothing short of a direct upgrade over everything it had in store, having improved upon several of its core mechanics thanks in no small part to years of catalog feedback, which was used rather ingeniously to address common complaints and ultimately sharpen its systems. Still, I must say that there have been waves of mounting this content with things such as how the gameplay bends around stuff such as procedural elements, with certain errors hiding layers that the majority of players likely won't ever be able to experience, the multiverse twist that rapidly loses its luster after the first planet you visited, and a latent feeling that the Souls-like Guns formula failed to adapt to modern standards. Personally, I don't necessarily agree with every one of those statements, but from my perspective, the game does lean somewhat heavily into the philosophy that not every run needs to be identical, and not every secret should be solvable with intuition alone, and depending on who you ask, that's either brilliant or terrible design. In any case, once you step through your first world stone and the scenery snaps into something completely different yet more or less recognizable, the game took tidings with the reminder that you're here on unfinished business and it finally is showtime. What pulls you deeper isn't just the threat of a looming catastrophe up ahead, but the way the game frames you as another wild card popped up out of nowhere who is suddenly on track to chase down cosmic entities while refusing to be erased no matter what, sort of retracing the steps of those who came before. That's a super brisk summary of the juice that gets us moving, and in the chapters ahead, we'll carefully dissect what makes Remnant 2 a literal buffet that surpasses its predecessor for some people, while for others its pitfalls might risk counting the experience into a total drag. Following the tradition of storytelling that doesn't rely on walls of text to clue you in, Remnant 2 leans on a slightly overused recipe that dares you to fill in the lore gaps yourself in order to make sense of what goes around you. That's because the game knows exactly how much it can get away with by letting its environments do the talking, and so it assumes you'll eventually be willing to meet it halfway in a really bold gamble, trusting that whatever it chooses not to show outright will be found through atmosphere and implicit lore. That said, believe it or not, the underlying tone remains as cryptic as it's ever been, and if you arrive hoping to get some sweet answers you've been looking forward to, then you should know that plenty of questions that haunted players after the first game unfortunately remain unanswered. Despite the release of a few DLCs that many hoped would serve as a means to tidy up what the base game didn't really bother addressing, many of the mysteries both old and newly introduced don't receive anything close to a satisfying conclusion. That ambiguity naturally fuels theories that a third installment is on the horizon, as that is the logical conclusion one must reach in hopes of seeing the semblance of a connection between the dots that Remnant 2 gestures towards, but doesn't actually dive into deeply enough. The story rambles in circles and occasionally takes some wild detours, offering just enough substance to stir curiosity, with the worlds themselves feeding into that instinctive urge to press deeper in search of answers that the game insists on refusing to hand over easily. From ancient temples overrun by crimson vines to alien wastelands orbiting a gargantuan black hole, each round picks up the slack by giving you breadcrumbs that hint at connections that the narrative never fully commits to exploring. On the flip side, the game's fate in its procedural system sometimes borders on bizarre, making luck a major factor in your playthrough, but one that acts more to the detriment of the overall experience. Entire biomes restructure themselves, altering accessible areas, dungeon chains, enemy types, and even opportunities for loot, but you also run into encounters that create random difficulty spikes or awkward lows in pacing, almost as if something is missing to tie the loose ends together. The idea behind these mechanics is meant to surprise players, keep them guessing, and make each run feel unique, but as we know, unpredictability without intention can backfire spectacularly, with stupidly rare events that most players likely won't even know exist unless they spend more time combing through online content than playing the game itself. The usual rebuttal for these claims is that this randomness boosts replay value, and while that's undeniably true, it also means a large chunk of content ends up locked behind the winds of dice rolls you have no meaningful control over. For instance, the randomization sometimes obscures proper level design behind arbitrarily shuffled set pieces, and certain encounters tread dangerously close to unfairness when the random number generator machine stops acting in your favor. While these pitfalls don't sink the whole experience, they definitely leave some ugly dents you cannot unsee once they catch your attention. Then there are moments when the game does a complete 180 and tries to be clever simply because it can, with hidden paths with almost no visual clues that they even exist, puzzles that are nearly impossible to decipher on the spot, and certain secrets being tailor-made for data miners. Although I have no doubt some players can relish their torment of hunting down answers designed to test the limits of their sanity, others will slam into the difficulty wall and wonder if accessibility was sacrificed just to maintain an aura of mystique that only a small percentage of the audience will be able to appreciate. Too frequently, you need borderline psychic deduction skills just to open a door guarding loot you can see but cannot really access even after looking around, leaving heaps of gear unobtainable unless you miraculously stumble on the solution or surrender to the wiki. The scarcity of clear guidance pushes these secrets into outright frustration, being cleverness that's not always worth entertaining. The intention behind this design is solid, yet the potential falls just short of greatness when you realize how much content the average player will never see, even if they're dedicated to thoroughly exploring everything they can reach without the power of knowing it all. That's to say, the game's bestest toys are locked behind an investment curve most people simply won't commit to, and that's a shame for a title brimming with creative ideas that fail to materialize in full potential due to poor execution of its concepts. Regardless, to give credit where it's due, when these systems work, the payoff can be reasonably generous. Your efforts are often rewarded with unique gear that bends your build in unexpected ways, offering satisfying synergies that wouldn't feel anywhere near as valuable if the game didn't choose to bury even worthless treasures behind convoluted layers of challenge. At the end of the trail, you're left with a game that gives off intense experimental vibes that remains capable of transcending its mismatched parts when everything falls into place every once in a while. Unfortunately, its wider structure doesn't always manage to keep up, occasionally slipping into a more is more mindset that throws complexity at you because complexity always sounds impressive on paper, even when the payoff is usually dubious. On the performance side of things, I'll have to quickly note that is also a bit of a mixed bag. The game holds a solid frame rate most of the time, yet some inconvenient micro stutters pop in occasionally no matter what kind of monster hardware you throw at it. Either way, before we lose track of where we are, Remnant 2 is the type of game that's messy and somewhat frustrating, but one that remains enthralling all the same despite its shortcomings. And that contradiction is precisely what makes Remnant 2 so hard to pin down and even harder to walk away from. The moment bullets start flying to the corners of the screen, that's when you know you're truly back where you're meant to be. And let me tell you, it's a damn good feeling. For those of you unaware, the gunplay actually serves as the bedrock the series is well known for, carrying the same half thump we've come to love over the years. Punchy, tactile, and surprisingly readable despite the visual chaos that often blankets the screen. Right off the bat, what really elevates these skirmishes is how the opposition behaves, as enemies don't just rush blindly at you. They flank, swerve, feint, and use their environments to keep you in a state of constant recalibration. It's a dance that rewards instinct as much as preparation, with the tempo shifting dramatically depending on the world you're thrown into. Needless to say, that energy seeps straight into the weapons themselves. The arsenal sprawls far beyond the usual lineup of boomsticks, offering everything from sidearms and long guns that twist combat rules in ways you only understand after firing a few rounds, to melee options that finally received proper love and cannot be vital components for some of the strongest builds in the entire game. There's an immense joy in picking up a firearm that looks like a joke and realizing it's actually a miniature apocalyptic tool in your hands, while a few swords can demolish most enemies with little effort depending on how they are integrated into your build. More importantly, the game doesn't try to punish curiosity, as swapping gear mid-run never feels like you're throwing away progress. Instead, it opens up avenues for experimentations, letting builds mutate on the fly rather than trapping you in a narrow identity. And since the game flexes harder its RPG ambitions this time around, the progression systems all claim for our attention, each one eager to prove its worth the moment you delve deeper into the Think-Ring strats. Aiming higher than last time while also being even more geared towards multiplayer co-op, you can feel the growing pains of a design team stretching its toolkit while still having to figure out how far those tools should bend without snapping. In short, what it brings to the table is a wealth of ways to customize your character and fine-tune builds, and together they form an intricate web that gives you plenty of room to fiddle, optimize, and maybe overthink every set point you drop before resetting, and then doing it all over again somewhere down the line. Following that same train of thought, that's where archetypes step into the spotlight at an opportune moment, letting you dive into the usual classes we have grown fond of, and there's an undeniable thrill in realizing a build you put together through means of improvisation actually works, especially when it melts bosses that previously felt untouchable. The cool thing is that, aside from the normal classes available at the start of the game, a few additional ones can be unearthed later on, which greatly adds to exploration, even though their unlocking methods aren't always the most straightforward. Each one of said classes offers a distinct lens through which to approach fights, and stacking them together creates a much deeper sense of ownership of your tactics that the first game only hinted at, and thus left much to be desired. And by the way, what surprised me most is how fluidly the sequel introduces multi-classing, reshaping your playstyle in ways that feel meaningful, while the upgrade paths allow you to carve an identity without locking you into a single strategy. Then there are the weapon mods and prism fragments, a 2-for-1 combo that acts as the grease that keeps the combat machine running smoothly, allowing you to sculpt your approach to fights with surprising nuance. Some mods act as emergency buttons, others are so overpowered that they alter the pace of engagements entirely, encouraging offensive bursts or calculated retreats, whichever befits your playstyle better. Meanwhile, the Prism offers passive enhancements you can obtain after downing powerful foes and in the form of rare chest drops, and when combined, the whole systems gain just enough spice to turn every encounter into pure mayhem, where your control of outcome is as granular as it gets. Going back a few steps, it's worth noting that the enemy design complements these systems with a level of brilliance that every so often borders on malicious, with every creature, humanoid or otherwise, being built to either pressure test your reaction time or drag you into sweaty slugfests that can leave you wondering why you didn't bring a bigger gun. It's worth mentioning that the game rarely serves you with recycled ideas, to the point that even similar enemies evolve by picking up new tricks as you hop between worlds, keeping the experience from going stale. As for boss encounters, they lean into mouth-watering spectacle with varying degrees of success. At their best, they are chaotic monstrosities you need to slowly whittle down by focusing on their weak spots, being tuned to make you rethink your entire build on the spot at times, but there's always a sense that one small adjustment could flip the entire script on its head. The game practically forces you into a crash course where every death is a lesson, where some fights don't make sense until you have died in them a few times, and only then do the patterns begin to click. Since I went through the entire campaign solo, I saw the harsher edges firsthand. Some encounters feel tuned for 2 or 3 players, where the challenge is more balanced between the group, and while beating them alone is definitely doable, it's often an exhausting undertaking that's full of moments where you just cannot believe the thing you're fighting is allowed to behave in a certain way. It's not a flaw for players who thrive on iterative mastery, but if you want fair warnings or readable telegraphs in order to win, trust me, the game isn't interested in offering that sort of comfort. Plus, even the easier fights retain an element of tension that keeps them from being a cakewalk, cause every boss likes to throw in at least one attack designed to punish complacency and remind you that you're never fully in control of your fate. This balance makes boss fights one of the most memorable aspects of the gameplay loop, but a nightmare for players looking to tackle hardcore unlocks, as the design can occasionally veer into bullshit territory, leaving you prone to the occasional unfairness like one-shots that kill no matter how much HP you have left. Additionally, the game's inner mechanics reveal an odd but compelling mixture of old-school grit and modern design, pulling heavily from established action and RPG playbooks, but stitching those influences together with just enough personality to stand apart. For every moment where the design falters, there's another that helps you off balance in a way that feels fresh, even when it's not always pleasant. To an extent, these peaks and valleys end up feeding the momentum rather than slowing it down. Even the journey a texture that's hard to dismiss even when the edges get rough. Even if seemingly not a whole lot changed in relation to the first game, the main combat loop stays extremely engaging from start to finish, propped up by systems that strive to elevate the best moments and cushion the worst. Some elements wobble under pressure, others overstay their welcome, but the core foundation is strong enough even in its messier stretches, as the game's relentless commitment to variety keeps the ride from ever feeling predictable, and that unpredictability ends up becoming a key part of its charm. What becomes clear as you ease into the latter half of Remnant 2 is that the pacing steadies out in a more forgiving rhythm, fights feel a lot less like disgusting coin flips, and the game's previously jagged learning curve gives way to a much smoother and enjoyable ride that's impossible not to appreciate. Looking at it from above, it's a trajectory that pays off, as the final stretch lands with the kind of confidence that suggests the developers understood the curve they were sculpting, even if the path getting there wasn't always an elegant one. In terms of length, the main campaign usually lands somewhere between 15 and 30 hours as an estimate, with playtime depending greatly on how much of the side paths you choose to explore, and that's without accounting for the 3 DLC expansions, which can quite easily double that amount of hours. The sheer volume of content available nowadays is genuinely impressive, with the game structure guaranteeing you have lots to see and overcome before you start getting bored. Even when the procedural layering gets overzealous, to the point you can tell at a glance when the algorithm is starting to falter, there's an odd sense of cohesion to the places you explore, as the worlds you visit settle into shapes that give the impression of being handcrafted. The seams in the fabric may be painfully visible if you go looking for them, yet the overall illusion remains intact well enough that the experience doesn't have to suffer for it, never becoming a big headache for anyone even mildly inconvenienced by the turbulence from the lack of predictability. These eccentric compositions end up reinforcing the game's identity, giving each playthrough the slightly off-kilter flavor that keeps the adventure from sliding into something forgettable. What would feel like sloppiness in another title ends up reading as character here, only becoming more and more appealing the longer you let it simmer. Given how the narrative sits in the passenger seat yet again, its presence ends up pairing rather nicely with the game's randomized nature, as it ultimately serves more as a connective tissue rather than a real driving force in our journey. Either way, what matters is that the story itself carries a certain charm despite its outer clunkiness, stitching together worlds and conflicts with enough intrigue to keep you invested without bogging the action down. As a direct continuation of this series, it's fair to say that the game has evolved with style, refining the formula where it counts and expanding where the first game left some bits of untapped potential up for takers. Needless to say, while it doesn't reinvent the franchise's identity from the ground up, it's almost always willing to push further than you would expect at a first glance, meaning that fans of the original will find plenty to latch onto, while newcomers get to understand why this universe is able to sell like hotcakes no matter the occasion. And in terms of raw value for those interested in diving into the game, I have to say that this is not the kind of experience you pick up for a weekend and put down forever. It thrives on the idea that players will return, refine builds, test new worlds, and keep nudging the boundaries of their own skill. On the other hand, those looking for a one-and-done cinematic ride might find its structure a bit sprawling, but I'm sure that for anyone who enjoys carving out their own pace will appreciate how much there is to dig into, with the sheer amount of permutations baked into the game translating into an infinite of oddball interactions you almost cannot try them all in a single lifetime. In general, I have to say that some players, mainly the ones who crave a rigid structure or tight polish, might end up dropping the game due to a few eccentric design choices that stand out and cannot really be overlooked. But if you enjoy mastering systems as much as I do, can appreciate some good old guns galore, and cannot help but find ingenious ways to overcome encounters that don't always play fair but also rarely fall into bland territory, then I can affirm that the experience delivers far more highs than lows, standing tall in the niche it carved for itself. For more reviews like this one, consider subscribing to avoid missing out on new analysis each month, and I swear you will not regret it. Also, liking and sharing the video is very much appreciated, and feel free to leave a comment as well if you want. I always read everything, and your feedback's what helps me improve. As usual, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time. Until then everyone, please take care.